He buried his wife. He mourned her for 5 years. He sent her mother $300 every single month. And then he discovered she was alive. This is the story of Jerome Williams, a man who honored a deathbed promise so faithfully that it nearly destroyed him. A man who loved so deeply that he never thought to question. A man who learned the hardest lesson imaginable, that the people closest to you can become the architects of your ruin. What Jerome uncovered wasn't just a lie. It was a system. A cold, calculated machine designed to drain his bank account, manipulate his emotions, and keep him trapped in a grief that was manufactured from the start. But before we go any further, I need you to understand something. This story isn't just about one man's tragedy. It's about how love and loyalty can blind us to the truth. How we can be so focused on keeping promises that we forget to verify what we're told. How documents, signatures, and bank accounts can become weapons in the hands of people we trust. Jerome's story is a warning. And by the end, you'll never look at a promise the same way again. It started, like so many tragedies do, with a hospital bed. Kesha Williams was 34 years old when the cancer took hold. Stage for lymphoma. The doctors gave her weeks, maybe a month. Jerome sat beside her every night, holding her hand while machines beeped and nurses shuffled past in the hallway. Their daughter Zara was only 3. Too young to understand why mommy couldn't come home. Too young to know that her world was about to shatter. On Kesha's final night of lucidity, she gripped Jerome's hand with surprising strength. Her eyes, sunken but still fierce, locked onto his. "Promise me something," she whispered. Jerome leaned closer. "Anything. Take care of my mom. She's got nobody else. Promise me you'll look after her, no matter what." Jerome didn't hesitate. "I promise." 3 days later, Kesha was gone. The funeral was a blur. Jerome barely remembered the service, the flowers, the condolences from people whose faces he couldn't recall. What he remembered was Diane Jefferson, Kesha's mother, pressing a crumpled piece of paper into his hand at the reception. "This is my account information," she'd said, voice trembling. "Kesha told me you'd help. I'm on a fixed income. I can barely afford my medications." Jerome looked at the paper. Routing number, account number, a name. He didn't question it. His wife had just died. His world had collapsed. And here was something concrete he could do, one promise he could keep in a universe that had just proven how fragile everything was. The first payment went out the following week. $300. Same amount every month. Same date. Same account. For 5 years, Jerome Williams never missed a single payment. Not when his transmission died, and he couldn't afford to fix it. Not when Zara needed braces, and he had to take out a loan. Not when the electric company threatened to shut off his power in the middle of a Chicago winter. He'd stare at his banking app, watching his checking account balance hover near zero, and he'd still hit send. Because a promise to a dying wife was sacred. Because he loved Kesha, and this was all he had left of her. Because he never once stopped to wonder if everything he believed was a lie. The night everything changed started like any other. Jerome stood at his kitchen counter, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the transfer confirmation. $300. Same amount. Same date. The 5th anniversary of this routine had passed 2 months ago, but the weight of it never got lighter. His phone chimed. Another notification. Final notice. Electric service disconnection if $167 not received by Friday. Jerome's jaw tightened. He scrolled through his banking app, doing the math he'd done 1,000 times. Rent, groceries, Zara's school supplies, gas for the truck, and those $300 that disappeared like clockwork into Diane Jefferson's account. "Daddy, can we get pizza tonight?" Zara bounced into the kitchen, backpack still strapped to her small shoulders. Her smile was pure Kesha, bright, infectious, capable of making him forget his troubles for a moment. But tonight, even his daughter's joy couldn't break through the weight pressing on his chest. How about grilled cheese instead? Jerome crouched to her level, smoothing a hand over her braided hair. "I got that fancy bread you like." Her face fell for just a second. Then she nodded with the kind of resilience that made his heart ache. She'd learned not to ask for things they couldn't afford. That night, after Zara was asleep, Jerome's phone buzzed with a text he'd never received before. "Zenda, Diane Jefferson. I need to discuss payment methods. Call me tonight." Jerome frowned. In 5 years, Diane had never wanted to discuss anything. She accepted the money with cold efficiency. Never asked about Zara. Never acknowledged his sacrifice. Something felt wrong. What would you do if you got a message like that after 5 years of silence? Would you call back, or would your gut tell you to start asking questions you'd been avoiding? Tell me in the comments. Because Jerome was about to make a choice that would unravel everything. And he had no idea that the woman he'd been sending money to might not be the person he thought she was. The phone sat on Jerome's nightstand like a loaded weapon. Diane's text glowed on the screen. I need to discuss payment methods. Call me tonight. For 5 years, communication had been simple. Money in, silence out. No thank yous. No updates. No acknowledgement that Jerome was slowly drowning himself to keep her afloat. So why now? Why tonight? Jerome's electrician instincts kicked in, the same instincts that told him when wiring was faulty, when a connection was dangerous, when something looked right but functioned wrong. Something here didn't add up. Instead of calling Diane, he walked to his closet and pulled down a box he hadn't touched in years. Kesha's things. The items Diane had given him after the funeral. All that remained of his wife's physical presence in this world. He lifted the lid slowly, bracing himself for the wave of grief that always came with these memories. Her wedding ring, a hospital bracelet, a few photographs, and at the very bottom, a business card from the funeral home with Diane's handwriting on the back. Jerome pulled out the card and read the note, "Pick up cremation certificate, Tuesday." Then he reached into his wallet and retrieved the crumpled paper Diane had given him at the funeral, the one with her bank account information. He held both pieces of paper side by side, and his blood ran cold. The handwriting was completely different. Not just slightly different. Completely. Different people. Different slant. Different spacing. Different ways of forming letters. If Diane had written the funeral home note, then who had written the bank account information? Jerome sat on the edge of his bed, heart pounding. For 5 years, he trusted. For 5 years, he never verified. For 5 years, he'd been so consumed by grief that he'd never stopped to ask the most basic questions. Where was the money actually going? Was Diane even receiving it? And if she wasn't, who was? The next morning, Jerome made a call he hadn't made in months. Troy Henderson answered on the second ring. They'd been best friends since high school, the kind of friendship that survived marriages, divorces, and everything in between. Troy now worked customer service at First National Bank, which meant he had access to information Jerome desperately needed. I need a favor, Jerome said without preamble. And I need you to not ask questions. Troy was at his door by 7:30, 2 coffees in hand, and a look that said he'd already broken rules to be there. They sat on the front porch, watching Zara's school bus disappear around the corner before Troy finally spoke. I pulled up the account you've been sending money to. His voice was heavy. And Jerome, something's very wrong. He handed over a folded printout. I can't give you transaction details, privacy laws, but I can tell you patterns. That account isn't being used like an elderly woman paying bills. There are deposits coming in from multiple sources. Your $300 is transferred out within 24 hours every single month. And the amounts moving through that account are way bigger than what you're sending. Jerome stared at the paper. $800, $1,200, $2,000. Deposits appearing weekly. His contribution looked small by comparison. It looks like a funnel, Troy continued. Money comes in, money goes out. Almost immediately. Like someone's washing it. Jerome's mouth went dry. Laundering. That's what it looks like to me. If stories about betrayal and hidden schemes pull you in, make sure you're subscribed, because what Jerome discovers next changes everything. Troy slid another piece of paper across the porch railing. There's more. The address on file for this account? It's not where you think Diane lives. It's a place called Riverside Apartments. Oak Street. Apartment 214. Jerome didn't recognize the address, and the name associated with that apartment. Troy's voice dropped. It's not Diane Jefferson. Jerome's heart stopped. Whose name is it? Troy hesitated, as if saying the words out loud would make them real. The lease is under the name K. Williams. Williams. His last name. For a moment, Jerome couldn't breathe. His mind raced through explanations. Maybe Diane had used Kesha's name for some legal reason. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe. But even as he grasped at excuses, something deeper was shifting. A foundation he'd built his life on for 5 years was beginning to crack. Troy stood slowly, handing Jerome one last thing. A business card. Marcus Reed. Private investigator. He specializes in financial fraud. If someone's been playing you, he'll find out. After Troy left, Jerome sat alone with the transaction records spread across his lap. The numbers told a story. Money flowing in from multiple sources. His payments and others being redirected somewhere else entirely. An address that didn't match. A name that shouldn't exist. And underneath it all, a terrible possibility he couldn't quite bring himself to face. Because if everything he believed about Diane was a lie, then what did that mean about the woman who'd made him promise to take care of her? What did it mean about Kesha's death? And what if the ashes sitting in an urn on his dresser belonged to someone he'd never even met? Jerome drove to Riverside Apartments the next morning with his stomach in knots. The building looked nothing like a place an elderly woman would live. It squatted between a laundromat and a check-cashing place, its facade weathered by years of neglect. No garden, no guilcho ramps, no sign of a senior community. This wasn't a retirement complex. This was a place people used when they didn't want to be found. He found the building manager in a cramped office that smelled like cigarettes and stale coffee. A tired man named Pete barely looked up from his racing form when Jerome walked in. "I'm looking for someone who might live here," Jerome said. "Diane Jefferson, apartment 214. Pete flipped through a worn binder. 214th's been rented to the same person for about 3 years. Quiet tenant. Pays on time. He found the page. But there's no Diane Jefferson in this building. Jerome's pulse quickened. Then who's in 214? Pete squinted at the lease. Say here the name is Kesha Williams. The world tilted. Jerome gripped the counter to steady himself. That's my wife's name. Pete shrugged. Well, she's alive enough to sign checks. You want to see the security footage? Sometimes it helps people confirm if they know a tenant. Pete led him to a cramped room where a grainy monitor displayed the building's lobby. He scrolled backward through days of footage, residents coming and going, pizza deliveries, late-night returns. And then Jerome saw her. The woman walked through the lobby with a familiar grace that made his heart stop. Her hair was shorter, darker than he remembered. But the way she tilted her head while checking her phone, that was a gesture he'd watched 1,000 times across breakfast tables and lazy Sunday mornings. When she turned toward the camera, Jerome's breath caught in his throat. Those eyes. Those were Kesha's eyes. The face was older, thinner. But unmistakably, impossibly, it belonged to the woman he'd buried 5 years ago. That's her, Pete said casually. Kesha Williams. I live alone as far as I know. Gets visitors sometimes. The timestamp was read 3 days ago. Jerome watched more footage, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. Kesha walking in with expensive grocery bags. Kesha dressed for what looked like a date. Kesha laughed into her phone like a woman without a care in the world. And then, in one clip from the previous week, she turned in profile. The curve of her stomach was unmistakable. She was pregnant. His dead wife was alive. She was living 20 minutes away under her real name. She was healthy, happy, expecting a child with someone else. And she'd been collecting his money through an elaborate deception while he struggled to keep the lights on for their daughter. Jerome stumbled out of the building and barely made it to his truck before his legs gave out. Everything he'd grieved, everything he'd sacrificed, every promise he'd kept, all of it was built on a lie. That night, he called the private investigator. Marcus Reed answered with the calm voice of someone who'd heard stories like this before. My wife faked her death 5 years ago, Jerome said, the words feeling impossible even as he spoke them. I just saw her on security footage. She's been taking my money through her mother's account, and I need to know how deep this goes. Marcus didn't seem surprised. This kind of scheme is more common than you'd think, he said. Life insurance fraud, staged deaths, identity manipulation. The question is, do you want to expose it for closure, or do you want to press charges? Jerome thought about Zara sleeping peacefully down the hall. About 5 years of birthday parties where she'd blown out candles wishing her mother could see her. About explaining to an 8-year-old that mommy wasn't dead, she just chose to leave. "I want the truth," Jerome said. "Whatever it costs." Then we start gathering evidence tomorrow. If you were Jerome right now, staring at footage of your dead spouse living a new life, would you want answers or revenge? Would you protect your daughter from the truth, or would she deserve to know? Drop your honest answer in the comments. Because what Jerome discovered next made everything he'd seen so far look like a warm-up. The woman on that screen wasn't just alive. She was part of something much bigger. And Jerome? He was about to find out he wasn't her only victim. Marcus Reed showed up the following week with a folder thick enough to choke a horse. The private investigator had the tired eyes of a man who'd seen too many families destroyed by the people they loved most. He spread documents across Jerome's kitchen table like autopsy photos. "Let's start with the hospital," Marcus said, pulling out the first sheet. "According to Mercy General's records, your wife was discharged alive on March 15th, 2019, 3 days before the date you believe she died." Jerome stared at the paper. There was Kesha's name, her diagnosis, status, stable, discharged to family care. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I was there. I held her hand when she—" "Were you there for the actual moment?" Marcus interrupted gently. "Or were you told afterward that it happened?" The question cut through everything Jerome thought he remembered. He recalled sitting in the waiting room. A nurse came out with tears in her eyes. Diane collapsed against him, sobbing. The chaplain asked if he needed anything, but he hadn't been in the room when Kesha died. Diane had been alone. Marcus produced another document, a death certificate. This was filed to the county general, he said. Different hospitals, same date, and the doctor who signed it. He tapped the name. Had his license suspended 2 months later for falsifying medical records. Jerome's vision blurred. So the death certificate is fake. Almost certainly. The next document hit even harder. Riverside Funeral Home has no record of cremating anyone named Kesha Williams on the date listed in your paperwork. Marcus paused. However, they did cremate an unidentified Jane Doe from the county morgue. Same day, same time slot, paid for in cash by an anonymous donor. The implication landed like a punch to the chest. The urn in your closet, Marcus said quietly, contains the ashes of a complete stranger. Jerome thought about all the nights he'd talked to that urn, all the times he'd let Zara kiss her fingers and touch the cool metal, whispering goodnight to her mother. He'd been mourning someone he never knew. If stories about manufactured grief and systematic deception get under your skin, hit subscribe now, because the betrayal goes even deeper than Jerome imagined. Marcus wasn't finished. There's also the matter of life insurance. He pulled out a payout statement, $50,000, paid to Diane Jefferson as beneficiary 4 months after the supposed death. The beneficiary was changed from you to her mother 3 days before everything went down. I never knew about that, Jerome said. You weren't supposed to. The documents painted a devastating picture. A woman who'd wanted out of her marriage, but didn't want to lose everything in a divorce. A mother willing to help orchestrate the disappearance. Fake medical records. A stranger's cremated remains. Insurance money to start fresh. And a husband so consumed by grief that he never thought to verify any of it. There's one more thing. Marcus closed the folder. The account you've been sending money to? It's receiving payments from at least 4 other sources. Monthly. Regular. Same pattern as yours. Jerome felt the blood drain from his face. You mean I'm not the only one being scammed? Not even close. The system suddenly became clear. Diane, or whoever was operating that account, wasn't just taking money from Jerome. She was collecting from multiple grieving spouses, multiple believing widowers, multiple people whose love had been weaponized against them. This wasn't a family betrayal. This was organized crime. And somewhere in Chicago, living comfortably on the proceeds of manufactured grief, was the woman Jerome had promised to love until death did them part. She'd just forgotten to mention the death would be hers. What do we do now? Jerome asked. Marcus leaned back. Now you have a choice. We can go to the authorities. FBI has jurisdiction on wire fraud, and they can build a federal case. or you can confront her directly and try to get answers. If I confront her, I might not get the truth. If you go to the feds, you won't control how this ends. Jerome looked around his modest kitchen. The bills piled on the counter. The photos of Zara on the refrigerator. The life he barely held together while funding someone else's freedom. I want justice, he said finally. Not just for me. For everyone else, she's doing this too. Marcus nodded slowly. Then I'll make some calls. But Jerome, once this starts, there's no going back. The woman you married is going to prison. Your daughter is going to learn her mother is alive and chose to leave. Everything comfortable about your life is going to get very uncomfortable. Jerome thought about the alternative, sending another $300 next month, and the month after that, forever feeding a system designed to drain him dry while Kesha lived free. Make the calls, he said. The choice was made. But what Jerome didn't realize was that Diane was already watching, and she was about to make a move that would force everything into the open. The trap was set 2 days later. Jerome received a text from Diane's number, the first direct communication in years that wasn't about missed payments. We need to talk. Lincoln Park. Tomorrow at noon. Come alone. Marcus reviewed the message with a grim smile. She's panicking. The payment didn't come through. She knows something's wrong. So I'm walking into something dangerous. You're walking into something controlled. Marcus produced a small recording device. You'll be wired. FBI agents will be positioned throughout the park. Your only job is to get her talking. The next morning, Jerome found himself on a park bench overlooking Lake Michigan, a wire taped to his chest and his heart pounding loud enough to drown out the waves. He spotted the surveillance team first. An agent jogging with a borrowed dog. Another reading a newspaper on a nearby bench. Marcus in a maintenance uniform, trimming hedges that didn't need trimming. And then he saw her. Diane Jefferson walked toward him with the brisk pace of someone 20 years younger than her supposed age. The frail, elderly woman from the funeral was gone. In her place was someone sharp, alert, dressed in designer jeans and a leather jacket that hadn't come from fixed-income budget. She sat on the far end of the bench, purse clutched tight like she was ready to run. You've put me in a very difficult position, she said without greeting. I've put you in a difficult position. Jerome kept his voice steady. I've been sending you $300 a month for 5 years while barely keeping lights on. And now I find out the address I've been mailing Christmas cards to doesn't even exist. Something flickered in Diane's eyes. Fear, maybe, or calculation. You don't understand how this works, she said carefully. Then explain it to me. She lit a cigarette with steady hands. Your Kesha came to me 3 months before she supposedly died, crying about feeling trapped, wanting out but not wanting to lose everything, not wanting to hurt you or abandon Zara. I told her about people who could help, people who specialize in clean breaks. Jerome's jaw tightened. Clean breaks. New identities. Stage deaths. No mesi de borsis, no custody battles. Just gone. Like she never existed. Diane took a long drag. That was supposed to be the end of it. But then Kesha got greedy. Said if she was going to be dead anyway, why not stay dead and collect from you for a while? She knew you'd never stop sending money. She'd studied you for 10 years, Jerome. She knew exactly which buttons to push. The words landed like punches. So the monthly payments were her idea. Every penny. Jerome forced himself to breathe. And the life insurance. $50,000. Startup capital. New city. New name. New life. How many people are you doing this to? Diane's eyes narrowed. Enough to make it profitable. There it was. The confession. On tape. Admissible in court. But Jerome needed more. Where is she now? Diane smiled coldly. Florida. Pregnant with her real estate developer boyfriend's baby. She sends me 20% of whatever she collects from you and 2 other men who can't let go of their dead wives. The system was suddenly clear. Multiple victims. Multiple revenue streams. A network designed to harvest grief and convert it to cash. If you were sitting on that park bench, listening to your dead wife's mother explain how you'd been systematically exploited for years, what would you do next? Would you keep your cool for the recording, or would everything come crashing down? Tell me in the comments, because Jerome was about to test his limits. You know what the funny part is? Diane continued, unaware of the net closing around her. You could have stopped this any time. One phone call to verify my address. One question about why I never invited you over. But you didn't. Because you were so in love with your promise that you forgot to think. Jerome stood slowly. You're right, he said. I trusted when I should have verified. I loved when I should have questioned. But that ends today. He gestured toward the agents emerging from their positions. Diane's face went pale. What have you done? What I should have done 5 years ago, Jerome replied. I stopped being anyone's fool. As federal agents closed in with handcuffs ready, Diane's final words echoed across the park. You have no idea how big this is. You have no idea what you started. But Jerome didn't care anymore. He was finally cutting the power to a machine that had been bleeding him dry. And somewhere in Florida, a woman who'd built her new life on his grief was about to learn that the payment had permanently stopped. Diane was in custody by sunset. Agent Sarah Chun debriefed Jerome in a gray-walled conference room at the federal building, the recording from the park playing on a loop while she took notes. This is solid, Chun said, but it's just the beginning. The account patterns Marcus identified show funds flowing in from at least 4 states. Your wife isn't just running a personal scam, she's part of a network. How big? We're looking at 17 potential victims so far. Maybe more. Chun closed her notebook. Stage deaths, fake relatives, grieving spouses sending money to people who either don't exist or fake their own deaths. The total estimated theft exceeds $400,000. Jerome tried to absorb the scope. His $18,000, a fortune to him, was a rounding error in a scheme this massive. What happens now? We flip Diane for information on the network. Then we go after the operators, including your wife. Kesha. She's using 3 different names now. Chun slid a folder across the table. Kesha Williams in some places. Kesha Martinez in others. Kesha Johnson when she's feeling creative. Jerome opened the folder. Inside were surveillance photos taken in Miami. Kesha on a beach. Kesha at a restaurant with a man in a designer suit. Kesha touched her swollen belly with a smile that looked genuinely happy. She'd moved on completely. Built a new family. Started a new life, while he'd been drowning. The man she's with is a real estate developer, Chun continued. Clean record as far as we can tell. He probably has no idea about her past. Will you tell him? That depends on how cooperative she is when we arrest her. The arrest came 3 weeks later. By then, Diane had cut a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. She provided names, account numbers, methods of operation. The grief fraud network, as the FBI called it, had tentacles in Illinois, Florida, Texas, and California. Kesha was picked up at her Miami apartment on a Tuesday morning, still in her bathrobe, the pregnancy now obvious. The charges: wire fraud, conspiracy, insurance fraud, identity theft. Maximum combined exposure, 30 years. Jerome watched the news coverage from his living room, Zara at school, Sparky, the puppy they'd finally gotten, asleep at his feet. The woman on screen was escorted to a waiting car, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. She'd spent 5 years believing she was untouchable. She was wrong. If watching justice unfold in cases like this gives you hope, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens in the courtroom changes Jerome's life forever. The trial prep consumed the next several months. Jerome provided testimony, documentation, and bank records. He sat for depositions that lasted hours, answering questions about his marriage, his grief, his failure to verify. The defense tried to paint him as negligent, a man so blinded by emotion that he'd never bothered to check basic facts. And in a way, they were right. But that didn't make his pain any less real. It didn't make the fraud any less criminal. And it didn't change the fact that the system he'd trusted had been designed from the ground up to exploit exactly that kind of love. When Jerome finally took the stand, the courtroom was packed. Other victims sat in the gallery. Reporters lined the back row. And across the room, at the defense table, Diane Jefferson looked like she'd aged 20 years in custody. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres, walked Jerome through the timeline. The hospital, the funeral, the monthly payments, the discovery, Mr. Williams, Torres said, can you describe the financial impact of this fraud on your family? Jerome looked at the jury. 12 ordinary people trying to understand how love could become a weapon. I sent $300 every month for 5 years, he said. That's $18,000 total. During that time, I fell behind on my electric bill. I couldn't afford my daughter's dental work. I drove a car that broke down constantly because I couldn't afford repairs. He paused, but the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was believing I was honoring my wife's dying wish. The worst part was talking to an urn that held a stranger's ashes. The worst part was explaining to my daughter why Mommy couldn't be at her birthday parties when all along Mommy was alive and building a new family with money taken from ours. The courtroom was silent. When sentencing came, Judge Patricia Morales looked at Diane with barely contained disgust. Ms. Jefferson, you participated in one of the cruelest schemes this court has ever encountered. You preyed upon people at their most vulnerable. You weaponized love and loyalty for profit. She paused. The court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison. Diane's face crumpled. At her age, it might as well have been life. But Jerome felt no triumph. Only the hollow satisfaction of finally cutting loose the anchor that had been dragging him under for 5 years. Kesha's trial was still months away, and the hardest conversation Jerome would ever have was still waiting at home. The question came on a Saturday morning. Zara was sprawled on the living room floor, Sparky stretched out beside her, both of them watching cartoons. The news had been running coverage of the fraud network arrests for weeks, and Jerome had done everything possible to shield her from it. But kids see more than parents realize. Daddy, Zara said without looking away from the screen. That woman they keep showing on the news. She looks like the pictures of Mommy. Jerome's blood turned to ice. He'd prepared for this conversation, rehearsed it in his head 100 times. But now that the moment was here, every word evaporated. Come sit with me, he said finally. She climbed onto the couch, puppy following, eyes wide with the kind of trust that made what he had to say even harder. You know how I told you that Mommy died when you were little? Zara nodded. And you know how sometimes grown-ups don't tell the whole truth because they think they're protecting the people they love? Another nod, slower this time. Jerome took a breath. Mommy didn't die the way I thought she did. Some bad things happen, and she's still alive. Zara's face went through a dozen emotions in seconds. Confusion, hope, fear, confusion again. She's alive. Yes. Then why didn't she come home? Jerome felt his heart crack. That's a question I'm still trying to answer myself. What I know is that she made some very bad choices. Choices that hurt a lot of people, including you and me. Is she the reason we could never afford pizza? Leave it to an 8-year-old to cut straight to the heart of things. In a way, yes. Zara was quiet for a long moment. Sparky whimpered and licked her hand. I'm mad at her, she said finally, for not picking us. That's okay. You're allowed to be mad. Are you mad at her, Daddy? Jerome considered the question carefully. He'd spent months wrestling with it himself. I'm mad at what she did, he said. I'm mad at the lies. But I think being mad forever would just hurt us more. Zara leaned against him. I'm glad you told me the truth. I'd rather be sad about what's real than happy about something made up. Jerome pulled her close, tears burning his eyes. At 8 years old, his daughter understood something it had taken him 5 years to learn. Love without truth was just another kind of prison. Have you ever had to deliver news that would shatter someone's world? Did you tell the truth, or did you try to protect them with silence? I'd love to know your story. Drop it in the comments below. Later that night, after Zara was asleep, Jerome sat on the back porch with a letter in his hands. It had arrived 2 days ago from a federal correctional facility in Florida. Return address, Kesha Williams. He'd been staring at the envelope without opening it, unsure whether he wanted to know what was inside. Finally, he tore it open. The handwriting was shaky. Different from a confident script he remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards. Jerome, it began. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I know you probably hate me. You have every right to. I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not because I got caught. I was sorry long before that, but because I never had the courage to tell you the truth when it mattered. I felt trapped in our life. Not because of you, exactly, but because of everything. The house. The bills. The responsibility. I wanted out, but I didn't want to hurt you or lose Zara. So I made terrible choices. And I convinced myself that you'd be fine eventually. That you'd move on. That the money was a kind of compensation for everything I'd taken from you. I was wrong. About all of it. I'm not writing this to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve that. I'm writing because you deserve the truth, and I never gave it to you. Maybe this letter is too late to matter, but it's the only thing I can give you now. Kesha. Jerome read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and sliding it into a drawer. He didn't know what to feel. The apology seemed genuine, but words on paper couldn't undo 5 years of manufactured grief. What he did know was this. He'd spent too long mourning a ghost. It was time to start living for the daughter who was real, present, and counting on him. The next morning, he made pancakes. They weren't perfect, but they were something. And for the first time in years, Jerome Williams felt like he might actually be okay. 6 months after the trials ended, Jerome stood in a kitchen that looked nothing like the one where this nightmare had begun. New appliances hummed quietly. The wiring was up to code. He'd done it himself. Fresh paint covered the walls that had once felt like they were closing in. The $18,000 recovered through federal asset forfeiture had gone toward this transformation. Not all of it. Some had vanished into legal fees and unpaid bills, but enough to finally stop survival mode and start actually living. Zara was doing better than he dared to hope. The school counselor reported she was adjusting well to family changes. She'd made new friends, joined an art club, started asking about college, even though she was only 9. And every month, $300 went into a savings account labeled Zara's Future. Same amount, same date, but now it was building something instead of feeding a lie. The Sunday dinner tradition had started organically. Troy and his girlfriend Maria came over most weekends now. They'd become the family Jerome had chosen, not related by blood, but bonded by something stronger. You seem different, Maria said one evening, helping him clear the table while Zara showed Troy her latest art project. Different how? Lighter. Like you finally put down something heavy. Jerome considered this. I spent 5 years carrying guilt for a death that never happened. Turns out, when you realize the weight isn't yours, it gets easier to walk. The promotion had come through at work. Electrical supervisor. 20% raise. Benefits. Respect from colleagues who'd watched him navigate catastrophe with quiet dignity. He was no longer the struggling widower barely keeping his family afloat. He was Jerome Williams, single father, survivor, someone who'd learned that verification wasn't an insult to love, it was a protection of it. If stories about rising from the ashes speak to you, make sure you're subscribed, because Jerome's journey has one final chapter. The hardest part of recovery was learning to trust again. Not other people. He could handle skepticism about strangers. The hard part was trusting himself. For 5 years, his judgment had been so catastrophically wrong that every decision now felt suspect. Was he making the right choice about Zara's school? The right choice about the house? The right choice about anything? Therapy helped. He'd started seeing someone after the trials ended, a counselor who specialized in victims of financial fraud. She'd helped him understand that his failure wasn't loving too much, but forgetting that love and verification could coexist. You're not naive for trusting your wife, she told him during their first session. You're human. Con artists specifically target people who love deeply. That's not a flaw, it's what they exploit. Slowly, Jerome started to believe her. He also started to rebuild his definition of success. Before, success had meant keeping a promise. Sending the $300. Honoring the memory. Now, success meant something simpler, being present. Being honest. Being the kind of father who told his daughter hard truths instead of comfortable lies. One afternoon, he found Zara at the kitchen table, working on a school essay. What's the assignment? He asked. We have to write about someone we admire, she said. I picked you. Jerome felt his throat tighten. Me? Why? She looked up with eyes that were so much like Kesha's, but carried none of the deception. Because when everything was fake, you stayed real. And when you found out the truth, you didn't pretend it didn't happen. You made things better. He pulled her into a hug before she could see the tears in his eyes. I'm proud of you too, baby, he whispered. More than you'll ever know. That night, after she was asleep, Jerome sat on the back porch and looked up at stars he'd been too exhausted to notice for years. 5 years ago, he'd made a promise to a woman who was already planning her escape. Today, he made a new promise, this time to himself. To never again let love blind him to truth. To always verify before he trusted. To build a life based on reality, not manufactured grief. And most importantly, to teach his daughter that honesty wasn't just a virtue. It was a survival skill. The final letter from the federal prison system arrived on a Tuesday. Jerome recognized the handwriting immediately, Kesha's shaky script, so different from the confident penmanship he remembered from shopping lists and anniversary cards. Inside was a single page. Jerome, it began. My sentencing happened yesterday. 22 years. With cooperation credit and good behavior, I might see the outside again when I'm 53. By then, Zara will be grown. You'll have built a life I can't even imagine, and I'll have missed all of it. I've had a lot of time to think about why I did what I did. The easy answer is that I was selfish, that I wanted out without consequences, that I chose comfort over responsibility. The harder truth is that I was scared of our life, of being stuck, of never becoming anything more than a mother and a wife in a house that always smelled like leftovers and laundry. None of that excuses what I did. I know that now. I built a new life on the bones of your grief. I let our daughter grow up mourning a mother who was perfectly healthy. I took your money and your love and your loyalty, and I used them all. You were the best husband I could have asked for, and I still chose to betray you. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to read this. But I needed to say it. I'm sorry. For all of it. For everything I took from you and Zara. For every birthday you struggled through alone. For every time she asked about me, and you had to lie. The woman you married wasn't entirely fake. But the woman who walked away was someone I hope you never have to meet again. Take care of our girl. She deserves better than I gave her. Kesha. Jerome read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer as the others. He didn't know what to feel. The apology seemed more genuine than the first one, more specific, more aware of the damage. But words on paper couldn't undo 5 years of manufacture mourning. They couldn't give him back the money. They couldn't explain to an 8-year-old why her mother had chosen a new family over the one she already had. Some wounds didn't heal with apologies. They healed with time and truth and the slow work of building something new. If you've ever received an apology that came too late to matter, or wondered whether forgiveness was something you owed or something you chose, share your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter. That weekend, Jerome took Zara to the cemetery. Not for Kesha. They'd scattered the stranger's ashes months ago, once they'd learned the truth, but for Kesha's father, who had died years before Jerome even entered the picture. Grandpa would have loved you, Jerome said as they stood before the modest headstone. Was he a good person? Zara asked. By all accounts, yes. He worked hard. He loved his family. He died before you were born, but your mom always said he was the best man she knew. Zara considered this. Do you think she forgot what being good looked like? The question hit harder than Jerome expected. Maybe, he said. Or maybe she just decided that being good was too hard. I'm not sure which is worse. They stood in silence for a while, the wind rustling through the old trees. Daddy, Zara said eventually, I don't want to forget what being good looks like. Jerome knelt beside her, taking her hand. Then remember this, being good isn't about never making mistakes. It's about being honest about the ones you make. It's about choosing people over convenience. It's about doing the right thing even when no one is watching. He paused. And it's about verifying. Always verifying. Because love without truth is just a pretty kind of prison. Zara nodded solemnly, like she was filing the words away for future reference. On the drive home, she fell asleep in the back seat, Sparky curled beside her. Jerome watched the road, thinking about everything he'd lost and everything he'd gained. The wife he'd mourned was gone, not dead, but no longer his. The obligation he'd carried was gone, exposed as a fraud, dissolved by truth. The grief was gone, replaced by a different kind of sadness, one that acknowledged reality instead of worshiping fiction. What remained was a life worth living, a daughter worth protecting, a future worth building. and a lesson worth sharing, that love and loyalty, for all their power, should never blind you to the truth. 1 year later, Jerome stood in his renovated kitchen, sunlight streaming through windows that no longer rattled in the wind. The calendar on the wall showed the 15th, the day that used to mean another $300 disappearing into the void. Now it meant another deposit into Zara's college fund. A small victory repeated monthly that added up to something real. Sparky was sprawled on his bed in the corner. Zara was at the table finishing homework. The house smelled like the lasagna they'd made together the night before. Ordinary, peaceful, true. Daddy. Zara looked up from her math worksheet. I finished early. Can we watch a movie? Any requests? She grinned. The one about the explorer who doesn't give up even when everything goes wrong. Jerome smiled. Of course, that was her favorite. They settled on the couch, Sparky wedging himself between them. As the opening credits rolled, Jerome felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Contentment. Not the manufactured peace of honoring a fraudulent promise. Not the exhausted relief of just surviving another month. Real contentment built on a foundation of truth. The fraud network had been dismantled. 17 victims had recovered significant damages. 3 other families had discovered that their dead spouses were alive and living under assumed names. Jerome's story had become a cautionary tale, featured in news articles, used in fraud prevention seminars, shared in support groups for victims of financial manipulation. He hadn't asked for attention, but if his pain could prevent someone else's, he'd learn to accept it. Kesha was still in prison, serving the first year of a 22-year sentence. Jerome had stopped reading her letters months ago. Not out of anger, though that had been part of it, but because he'd realized there was nothing she could say that would change anything. The past was the past. What mattered now was building a different future. If stories about transformation and truth resonate with you, make sure you're subscribed. This channel is dedicated to the stories that remind us what matters and how to protect it. The movie ended, and Zara was asleep against his shoulder. Jerome carried her to bed, tucking the covers around her the way he'd done thousands of times before. Her room looked different now. Gone were the shrine-like photos of a mother who wasn't dead. In their place were images of her own life, science fair ribbons, art projects, pictures with friends. She decided what her relationship with her mother would be. Not erasure, but not worship either. Just acceptance that some people made choices you couldn't understand, and your job was to learn from them without becoming them. Jerome kissed her forehead and stepped into the hallway. On the wall was a new family photo. Just the two of them and Sparky, taken at the beach last summer. No ghosts, no fictions, just the truth. He walked to the back porch and sat in the chair he'd occupied so many nights, staring at stars he'd been too exhausted to see for years. 5 years ago, he'd made a promise to a dying woman who wasn't dying. Tonight, he made a new promise to himself, to Zara, to anyone who would listen. Love is powerful, but it should never blind you. Loyalty is admirable, but it should never silence questions. Trust is essential, but it should always be verified. Documents matter. Signatures matter. Account numbers matter. And when someone asks you to honor an obligation without proof, no matter how much you love them, it's okay to say, "Show me." Jerome Williams had spent 5 years mourning a ghost, supporting a lie, and believing that love meant never questioning. He'd lost time. He'd lost money. He'd lost a version of himself that trusted too easily and verified too little. But he'd gained something more valuable. He'd gained the truth. And in the end, truth was the only foundation worth building on. The stars wheeled overhead. Somewhere in the house, Sparky whimpered in his sleep. Tomorrow would bring work and homework and the ordinary challenges of single parenthood. But none of it felt overwhelming anymore. Because Jerome Williams had finally learned the difference between manufactured obligation and genuine responsibility. Between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths. Between the person someone wanted him to be and the person he actually was. He was a father, a survivor, a man who'd walked through fire and emerged understanding one simple thing. That choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's the foundation that makes choosing others possible and meaningful. The $300 he used to send to feed a lie now fed a future. And for the first time in 5 years, Jerome Williams wasn't mourning. He was living.